Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this introduction to our Anger Masterclass series. I am Rashmira Balasubramaniam, and I will shortly introduce my colleague David Wetton, who will then introduce our special guest today, Lynn Sedgmore, who we're delighted to have here. So, as I said, thank you again for joining us. What we're going to cover today are some key topics and frameworks that we are going to cover in much more depth in the actual Anger Masterclass. However, what we're hoping is that you'll come away, even from today's session, with a clearer sense of where you and your organization sit in the anger spectrum that we'll introduce shortly. Also with a better understanding of your and your organization's relationship to anger. It may or may not be obvious or visible to you. We hope you'll also start to realize that anger can actually be a force for good. And not only that there is a path to greater awareness and greater mastery for both you and your organization with respect to anger. Just want to back up for a moment and say David and I met and started discussing this masterclass series last year, and we've titled it The Seasons of the Emotions, because we do want to cover a variety of emotions: anger, sadness, fear, and joy, each one of which correlates to one of the seasons. In some traditions, anger is correlated to spring, and as we're entering into spring now, it felt like a really important one to start with. Anger is also one of those topics that's often neglected in organizations, and yet there is a rising it's a case of people feeling and experiencing anger. And so that's why we are beginning with anger. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, David Wetton. It's been a joy getting to know David over the last year or so. David helps conscious leaders grow themselves and transform the performance of their organizations and their leadership teams. David's been both a senior executive and also a strategy consultant to a number of companies, many in the FTSE 100, and that includes Barclays, Volvo, and the Britannia Building Society. So as you can see, David's got a deep understanding of the day-to-day stresses and demands of today's organizational leaders. David has an MBA from Warwick Business School. We have a remarkably similar background. He and I both started our careers in Ernst & Young, training as chartered accountants. David also has a master's from Durham University Business School, and he is an ordained interfaith minister and spiritual counselor. And I've seen David time and again just bring a wonderful, calm, centered, grounded presence to everything that he does. And I know and have seen that he can hold space even when there are difficult topics or challenging issues that are arising, both for individuals and for groups. One of the things I also just want to mention about David is he hosts the Conscious Leadership Now podcast, which if you haven't listened to, I would highly encourage you to listen to. He interviews a number of the world's top conscious leaders, including one of his early interviews was with Lynn Sedgmore. So it's highly recommended listening if you have a chance. And as a final note, one of the things I most enjoy about working with David is he is on a journey where he is doing his own inner work. And so that includes work with respect to anger, exploring, experiencing, sharing, being vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons that I know he's going to bring an incredible amount to all of the participants in both today's seminar and also in the masterclass. David.
Thank you, Rashmir. Now, Rashmir is currently an executive coach and advisor to current and emerging leaders of social and systems change, with a focus on transformational coaching for leaders, especially she calls super smart women who are ready for their next level of fulfillment and impact. And Rashmir is the founder of the recently launched Contemplative Edge Community, which is a place to slow down, go within with others, and bring a contemplative edge to everything that you do. Now, Rashmir has an MBA from Yale, no less, and together with over 25 years experience working across countries as diverse as East Africa, South Africa, USA, and the UK, together within a variety of sectors, from investment banking and consulting to global health and development. And so she's demonstrated her ability to build trust and consensus within diverse cultural and multidisciplinary groups. And no doubt she's seen and she's experienced anger across many cultures and industry sectors, which working with her gives me huge confidence in the way that she holds a safe and transformational space for whoever will turn up for this Masterclass series. And most importantly, it's been a delight to pull together this Masterclass series on anger with you, Rashmi. And I really appreciate your self-awareness and your self-mastery, which for both of us is an ongoing journey, I have to say. Now, a special guest accompanying us on this journey today is Dr. Lynn Sedgmore, CBE. And I think, as I said on the podcast, Lynn, where do I start or end with my introduction with you? Because Lynn has held 3 chief executive roles within further education in the UK for 17 years, including executive director of the 157 group of further education colleges. And she's been the chief executive of the Centre for Excellence in Leadership, known as CEL. Indeed, a book, Spiritual Leadership in Action, has been written by Professor Jodie Fry about her time at CEL, with the subtitle, Achieving Extraordinary Results Through Ordinary People. Now, Lynn was awarded the CBE by the Queen for her services to education in 2004, and she was named one of Debrett's most 500 influential people in the UK in 2015, and one of the UK's 100 Women of Spirit in 2016. Her organisations have won numerous national and international awards, including the International Spirit at Work Award. And it's important to note that all her organisations have achieved outstanding results. And indeed, these results have allowed her and given her license to be a pioneer in putting her ideas regarding spiritual and conscious leadership, I would say anger and power, into practice. And I've personally learned a lot from Lynn in how to relate to power in organizations and the accompanying role which anger plays. And she's here today because I respect and I love her authentic presence and passion for this topic of anger in the workplace. I know that she will contribute a lot and will ask, no doubt, many probing questions. So welcome to you, Lynn.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So we start our Masterclass journey with anger at work, that when me and Rashmi looked at that, it's going to be a series of 3 Masterclasses, 3 2-hour Masterclasses, and we split them up into 3 steps. First of all, just the cartoon on the left, where it's got someone looking at the door saying, be careful, that's where the boss keeps his ego feeding all day and all night. I have a sense that might resonate with quite a lot of you watching this presentation. Now, the first step that we look at in the first Masterclass is really looking at your past relationship with anger, and we call it My Story Thus Far. So what has anger been for you, and what's your relationship with anger? And do you know your triggers and your tendencies around anger? And we'll look at this a little bit later in this presentation. The second Masterclass then is called actually My Storyline Develops. So actually what we look there is actually becoming more self-aware. And as we say, responding to anger as opposed to reacting. And also locating anger in yourself and in your organization. And again, we'll have a look at that in a moment. And finally, the third Masterclass is actually entitled My Transformed Story. So we look at how we have many models that we'll use. We'll introduce a few today, but there's many more available. So how can you actually develop self-mastery with anger? How can you create a safe space for expression of anger in your organizations, both for you and for your colleagues? And as we alluded to before, how can you actually tap into what I call the transformational power of anger in the workplace?
Brilliant. Thank you, David. So let's get started. So the first question we have for you today is, how often do you feel anger? It's a little bit of a trick question, but one that we love you to just take a moment and think about, and maybe place yourself on this spectrum from very rarely to very often. And now David's going to share a story of his that might make you want to shift a little bit where you placed yourself. So we'll come back to that spectrum in just a moment.
Now that Lynn will recognise this photo, I think it was actually Lynn that recommended me to go to this place. This is actually Goliad Memorial Methodist Church in San Francisco, where they have the most wonderful singing. But my story isn't about singing. My story is about how I turned up, and after a fantastic service, I saw they had a men's group. And I do men's work. And I said, can I come along and help on the phone, and they said, yes, it happens tomorrow, Monday, please turn up at 10 a.m. So I turned up at 10 a.m. the following morning, and the person that invited me was nowhere to be seen. And I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you kind of just sense there's an atmosphere, and it's not an atmosphere that you would walk into on a voluntary basis. And I sensed this, and I suddenly realized the group of men meeting were actually those that were one step away from being in jail because of, I'm going to call it, their deviant expression of anger. And actually, I can still feel it in my body. My first sense actually was literally in the room to freeze, because here was men with expression of anger, which actually I really felt, I sensed, I suppress anger. Has been my pattern. And I froze. And so one of the guys just said, oh, you're new here, are you? And I couldn't say anything. I just sat down. He said, sit down over here. And it turned out their pattern was to actually, the one that had been there the longest shared their story. Then they came round to the new person. So I heard all the stories in the circle from these men. And as I listened to the story, the insight I had was that although they were expressing what I would call a deviant expression of anger, so they were being violent with wives, with people they knew, and they were coming to this group in order to be able to manage and express their anger healthily, I realized that yes, they had an actually really unhealthy expression of anger, the deviant expression, but I recognized in that moment, my suppression of my anger was also unhealthy. And in that room, I realized we were all men who had not really learned how to express our anger healthily. So that for me was a turning point in my journey in this exploration and passion for expression of healthy anger.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Now, if you tend to be on the more expressive side, chances are where you've placed yourself on the spectrum hasn't really changed very much based on what David shared. If, however, you're a bit more like David and tend to suppress your anger, I wonder whether you're starting to shift how you think about how often you feel anger, even if you don't express it externally. And a couple of just words that might help you think about this further is terms like passive aggressive can actually relate to a type of anger expression. Avoidant as well could be related. So often in society, even though we often think of anger as very much these outbursts, these outward expressions, there are lots of expressions of anger that might look or feel quite different to how we typically tend to think of anger. And so on the next slide, it's actually one of my favorite slides, and it's put together by the Gottman Institute because it really beautifully illustrates that anger is often just the tip of an iceberg. So we don't often realize how angry we actually are, but we might be more in touch with some of the emotions that are connected to anger, such as grief, overwhelm, feeling attacked, guilt, feeling trapped, feeling exhausted or annoyed. So there's any number of emotions that could be connected to anger and maybe clues as to both your anger tendencies, but also how often you tend to feel anger. So we'll go a little bit more further into the anger spectrum in a moment, but before we do, David's going to share a definition of anger.
Yeah, so what is anger? We had a straightforward dictionary one about a strong feeling of displeasure and usually of antagonism, which is helpful. But for me, being someone who likes the research, I went digging into the academic literature around anger. And this one for me is a richer one, and I'll explain very briefly why. But it says anger is an emotion that involves an appraisal of responsibility for wrongdoing by another person or entity, and often includes the goal of correcting the perceived wrong. And what I want to say about that, there's a number of areas in there which are worthy of much greater depth of exploration: appraisal, responsibility, correcting. So really within these anger masterclasses, we want to go underneath, as we might say, underneath the bonnet or the hood of this definition of anger, and really find out what this means for you. And also, Rashmi has spoken about how anger can be expressed in a number of different ways. This slide here, that's been put together by Dr. Albert Wong in the States, really places anger in a wider emotional context. It's one of the number of emotions that we express. And for me, a healthy expression is a healthy expression of all of these emotions, including anger. And just focusing on anger, it just reiterates, I think, what Rashmi has said before, that anger isn't just about these real violent outbursts. If you have a look at the wheel, and what I was drawn to, he's actually got numb as being an expression of anger. And I went, don't get that one. But then I actually realized, actually, that was me when I freeze. And of course, numb can then be repressed, can almost go into depression, I think, in some of the things. But there's so many different ways that actually anger can be felt or expressed that we'll be working at this to say which ones really speak to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, David. And you mentioned depression. So with anger, there can be tendencies to direct it inwards or direct it outwards. If your tendency is inwards, depression could actually be one of the results. So again, we'll look a little bit more at that in a moment, and certainly in more depth in the masterclasses, but it's another thing to be thinking about. Do you direct your anger inwards at yourself or outwards at the apparent triggers or bystanders even? So here on this slide again, you can see the anger spectrum, and we've just broadened it out now to illustrate some of the different anger expressions, even though you may not historically have thought of some of these as expressions of anger. So on the extreme left is irritation. You can think of that as particularly very mild irritation, something that just annoys you, but it's not important enough to hold on to, and you quickly let it go. There you may have some talk in your head around things like I'm upset or I'm a bit annoyed. You may feel a little bit flushed and your tone may change, but again, if it's not an important thing, chances are it just passes through you. On the other extreme, it's at the very often side, but really it's just it's a extreme expression, if you like, are violent outbursts. And there, the inner talk might be, or it might not even be talk. You might not be in a state where you can actually think coherently, but are purely reacting from the sheer physicality of what you're feeling. And there, people tend to be consumed by anger and express it physically and violently, often just to get that intensity out of their bodies. Now, there's a lot of scope for different expressions of anger within those two extremes, of extremely mild irritation that you barely notice to the violent outbursts. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. You can see them on the slide, and you can see a little bit the internal talk that might be happening in people's minds, as well as the feelings that they might be feeling in their body. But the one I do want to reference is frustration, in part because for the longest time, I used to say, oh, I don't feel anger. And eventually, after reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book on anger, I realized, actually, gosh, there's quite a lot of frustration in me, and that is a form of anger. So that was hugely eye-opening for me, and actually only happened in my early 30s. So it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that I do actually experience anger. So as you look at that spectrum, do have a think about where do you tend to fall? And remember, you might fall in multiple places, depending on what's triggering you, or depending on the context, personal, professional, etc., that could be informing and triggering anger in you.
Thank you, Rashmi.
So as I mentioned, I didn't realize until my early 30s that I had anger in me. And so essentially I'd had my anger switch switched off. And it's been an absolute revelation over the last several years to start to become aware of the anger in me and to get comfortable with it, because my innate tendency, well, my learned tendency from my childhood had been to suppress it. And as I've gotten comfortable with it, it's been fascinating to observe myself in anger. My biggest trigger these days tends to be utility companies and poor quality helplines of utility companies. And I will be on the phone with a utility company and watching myself and thinking, I'm getting really angry and frustrated, and I need to not express it because that might not actually be helpful. So I'm sort of having this inner dialogue with myself as I'm trying to, achieve some outcome with the utility company. So it's really interesting. There have been a few cases where I've also watched myself spinning in anger. Now, prior to even recognizing I had any anger in me, I would never have done that, because I would have so quickly suppressed it that I wasn't in touch with the physical aspects of anger, or the mental inner talk, if you like, the self-talk that was going on in my head. But now there are a couple of experiences I've had over the last few years where I've almost, it's as though I've been enjoying the anger because it's fueling, it's exciting, I'm fully alive in my body. And I don't tend to express that externally, but it's just been interesting watching that dynamic. And I'm sharing this because I thought it might be interesting for people to see that actually you can, once you start to recognize your anger, get into observation mode with yourself, which can be hugely fascinating. And that, of course, is the first step towards developing mastery. Now, a couple of quick things to mention here is, as I referenced my childhood, I was in a family where one of my family members tended to have occasional outbursts, never violent, but they were strong enough that as a child, it didn't always feel safe to be around it. So that was one of the things that led to my having an anger response that was all about suppressing. It wasn't okay to be angry. And this is one of the messages many of us get in society, is that it's not okay to be angry. Anger is bad. Anger is not safe. And often as children, we tend to internalize that. And somewhere along the line, for many of us, the message becomes, anger is bad, so I am bad. And one thing I want to share here is, you are not your anger. So just something to be aware of. So do have a think about how societal, cultural, familial conditioning may have impacted your anger tendencies, your ability to talk about and speak about anger, or to recognize it in yourself, or even your ability to express it. And this applies not just at the family level. Organizations too have cultural tendencies and norms around anger. And so different organizations that you may have worked in may have different levels of allowing expressions of disagreements and anger, etc. And we'll come to that more in a moment.
Thank you, Rashmi. And we were sharing earlier, actually, around the cultural conditioning, how in Western society, it's predominantly been raised as a Christian, it can be actually that the relationship to anger can be through the kind of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, which feeds this aspect of anger is bad. But as I quite often say, well, let's read the passage around the turning of the tables, which the scholars believed didn't just happen the once, it probably happened 2 or 3 times through the Gospels. So there's a part of actually challenging where you are in relation to anger, and challenging where are you on that anger spectrum, and how can you then have a healthy expression, probably across a large part of that spectrum.
Brilliant. So we've talked a little bit about triggers, and David's going to share a bit more on triggers using the Enneagram in just a moment. But do, as you're thinking about what are your anger triggers, think about direct and indirect, personal or situational. So one of my triggers, as I mentioned, was poor helplines with utilities, where you're waiting for hours and hours to try to get things done, and they don't follow through. This is actually one of my organizational triggers, is when people in organizations or in teams say that they are going to do something and just don't do it. It's definitely one of my triggers, and that's a direct trigger. Both of those are direct triggers. There may be indirect triggers where you're observing a situation that is triggering you in some way, or where you're empathizing with whatever it is that you're observing, or it's making you worry. And so in organizations, that might be something like seeing the way that there's a lack of inclusion or a lack of equality. And even though you might not be party to that situation, it may trigger concerns and worry in you, or you may get angry on behalf of someone else, as an example. Likewise with situational, you may see something unjust happening in the world and be triggered by that. And that's certainly one of the ways that I think most of us can understand that anger can be a force for good, because it's showing us that there's something wrong there, even if we don't know exactly what it is or exactly what to do about it. It's useful information that's worth noting and acting on. We've talked about suppression or expression tendencies, inner and outer directed, so I won't repeat those here, but I do just want to mention something that we'll play with a little bit in the masterclasses, which is this idea of paradigms. And I've really learned some powerful techniques around paradigms from Keith Merrin, who's a long-standing organizational development consultant and coach, executive coach in the US. And one of the things that's very interesting with paradigms is we tend to get locked into paradigms. The way Keith defines them, they're a combination of beliefs, strategies, actions, and behaviors and goals often that play out. And with anger, especially if we're unconscious of the paradigms, we just may not be aware of how complicated our paradigm is, or where there are aspects with it that are keeping us locked into paradigms and behaviors that aren't actually helpful or productive. And so we'll look a little bit at anger paradigms so that you can start to have some awareness about how your anger paradigm is playing out and where and how you might choose to start to shift and change it.
Thank you. And Rashmi mentioned that this is not the masterclass. We won't go in great depth around the Enneagram, which is actually, it's a spiritual psychological tool. But I have been training the Enneagram in business, and I'm going to introduce it to help people actually identify their anger triggers. Rashmi spoke earlier about childhood patterns, and part of the power of the Enneagram is actually the ability to identify these childhood patterns, and then particularly you can do it in relation to anger. And my teacher in the Enneagram Enneagram in business, Ginja Lapri-Bogda, has actually written about conflict in the workplace, where she goes into anger. And what I love is that she's actually then identified for each of the Enneagram types, and you'll get support during the masterclasses to help you identify your type. So you identified then what are the triggers, and then how can you choose to respond to anger. And there's two benefits really of looking at this piece of work. One is you get to know there's triggers for yourself, and two, to know that people actually have different triggers and they respond differently when they are triggered. Can be just a revelation in itself, and really helpful for when you're working together in leadership groups or teams, to know that actually people are going to respond and react differently to circumstances that arise. So just to give you a very quick idea, for me on an Enneagram 9, Jinder talks about some of the common triggers can be when there's a disruption of peace and harmony. So that's me in that room with the men, feeling suddenly peace and harmony isn't there, or being told what to do, or rudeness in others, or feeling taken advantage of. And some of these I can react in a sort of passive way, or could do before I've kind of done this work. And she also gives ideas of how you can approach people of the different types when they're triggered. But then she gives some very valuable information, which we'll be sharing, around how you can then work with your triggers. So for example, for me, as an Enneagram 9, she said, actually part of you is actually step in with this and be open with people, share them as you're working with them in a working relationship, what some of your triggers may well be, so they're aware of them. And then if you are triggered, she says, for a 9, actually do something as soon as you're aware of this trigger and share the fact that you're triggered, because that can be the most difficult thing to do. And also it can be ways of managing. So it says for 9, actually, if you do feel triggered, perhaps something physical, going for a walk or taking time out, can be really helpful to get in touch with this and re-enter the situation, and then actually deal with this in a way which is really healthy. So we'll be looking at the Enneagram. That's one of the many tools we're using in the masterclass to help you get a handle on your anger, and then how to become more self-aware and bring some self-mastery to use of anger in the workplace. Of course, one of the questions, maybe hidden questions going through this presentation, is the anger in your organization? So here's someone looking perhaps, where is the anger in the organization? And I think through my experience, what I would say briefly is that named or not, anger is always present in your organization. So perhaps one of the very powerful things we'll do as one of the exercises is for actually you in these masterclasses to go back to your organization and have an exploration as to where anger is in your organization. Is it in a department? Is it in a person? Where does it reside? Where does it sit? Where does it need to be expressed?
Brilliant. Thank you, David. So this particular model here comes from a research model, the dual threshold model of anger in organizations. And the research behind it is really interesting, because historically, a lot of people have assumed that anger, the outcomes of anger in the workplace are negative. But there's actually quite a lot of positive outcomes from a variety of the expressions, whether the organization tends to suppress, express, or even the more deviant expressions of anger. So just to talk about a couple of those, so suppression is, if your organization is suppressing, chances are people aren't feeling safe to express anger, or it could be also the personality types are the 9s on the Enneagrams who just want to keep the peace at all costs. So, you know, a positive outcome is there's some sense of peace, but there's a lot of negative outcomes, including lack of performance or creativity, deep stress that's often held in the body of those individuals, and potentially, you know, relatively poor relationships as well. And you may, you know, some of the symptoms of this are you may see in groups and out groups. There may be issues of kind of prejudice and bias. Certainly there'll be a lack of safety. Healthy expression, I'm not going to say too much about, but because it's, you know, we know when there's healthy expression in the organization, we can feel it. People aren't afraid to raise an issue. Healthy disagreement is encouraged and welcome and actually engaged. So where there's an issue to be addressed, it's taken to the people and the places that can actually make a change and address that issue. So lots of positives here, obviously, but one of the negative potential outcomes of expression is, you know, some of the people that don't have literacy or an ability to manage anger, that maybe, you know, more on the suppressive side, can feel subdued because they're not comfortable or able to handle it. There are ways around that, of course. On the deviant side, you know, many of us, I'm sure, have experienced organizations where there's workplace bullying, there's scapegoating. Sometimes the scapegoating is of the person that's expressing anger. Sometimes the scapegoating is actually of everyone but the person that's expressing anger. So there's a variety of ways in which this can play out in organizations, and it's not usually healthy. However, there are times where a more deviant expression, so some kind of an outburst, can shock the organization into seeing an issue or waking up. So we're not saying any one of these is always good or always bad. There's complexity here, but hopefully you can start to identify when these types of things, what the tendencies of your organization are around anger, and whether there's room for shift or change. In the workshop, we'll talk a little bit more about this research, because they go quite deep in the research into what moves people and organizations across the thresholds from suppression to expression and deviance. And that could be quite useful for some of you.
Yes, I agree. And they actually look at how you can widen those thresholds, so you can actually have some kind of wider bandwidth for healthy expression of anger as well. So it's, and we'll get you to have a look at your organization and see where you sit. And you may well find it fascinating, because in my experience, sometimes it's not just the culture of the organization as a whole. You can find different departments have different relationships with anger, and it can be the interplay. My master's was understanding the links between departments, and of course anger and management of emotions across departments can be critical. So I'm hopefully beginning to see what a really important role, I believe, anger plays in organizations. And we really want to empower you to go back to your organizations and make a real difference around anger. One of the tools we'll be looking at of many is, I came across Christian Neff a few years ago, who's been working with self-compassion. And we're looking at self-compassion in witnessing anger. And what she says for her model, which I found useful, is whether perhaps you've suppressed your anger, or if you've expressed it in a way where you felt, actually, I might have hurt someone, I've really gone off the handle here. The first step, she says, is self-kindness. Be gentle and understanding with ourselves, because we tend to be harshly critical and judgmental, and perhaps shame and blame ourselves, or even blame others around it. So there's that word kindness as opposed to nice. Be self-kindness. The second step I really love, actually. And what she says, actually, she says common humanity. But for me, it means whatever your relationship with anger, there's going to be hundreds of thousands, probably millions of other people in the world that are also having a similar experience. So she says common humanity in a sense of, don't get yourself in a situation where you feel isolated and alienated through your suffering, through your expression of anger. No, you're not the only one. And once you have that understanding and ask the question, what can I now do? She brings in one element, she brings in his mindfulness to actually then look at our experience. We've been speaking about self-awareness, and we're also talking about self-mastery. But really the key is, rather than just ignoring our anger, whether it's suppressed or expressed in a deviant way, let's actually understand it and understand how it can be expressed in a way to make a real change. And kind of in summary, her tip one is actually we get to a place where we can choose to, I say, to respond as opposed to react. I think that's a healthy expression of anger. And a tip two is probably around this, if we've either suppressed or expressed, I know I had this experience, there can be some pain or some regret in there. But she said actually you needn't get stuck in that. The suffering, the ongoing pain is optional. You can use tools as ways to actually transform the situation, which is why I love her work.
Yeah, brilliant. And David, if I could just quickly jump in on that, because one of the things that reminds me of that I find a lot with organizational leaders and people in both private and nonprofit type organizations is we often live in our heads. And our discomfort with the feelings of anger in our body often also causes us to escape into our heads, which can actually be counterproductive in organizations, because if we don't take the time to sort of sit with what's arising, not necessarily trying to get rid of it, but just be aware, hence that mindfulness piece that you were talking about, we can often miss the opportunities that anger is pointing us to. So it's just something I just wanted to reference.
Thank you, Rashmi. We've already referenced Thich Nhat Hanh. He's got a book on anger. He's got a book, and I love the title actually, The Art of Power, because for me, we're getting into creative expression of anger then when it's healthy, I believe. But he does say when we live without awareness, without the ability to truly see the world around us, our life is often like a runaway train. So I know I can relate to that, and no doubt that those actually watching and listening also have a similar feel. And this aspect of anger and power dynamics, I'm sure something we'll pick up with Lynn, because one of the things I've learned with Lynn through her teaching is actually there are various paths of power, which really opened up my understanding around power. So, for example, the one we're all familiar with is actually probably the power over, I call it the patriarchal model, where you've got a boss that's controlling. But actually, there are a number of ways of expressing power. So it might be actually, it could be power with, shared, collaborative sort of power, could be power for, on behalf of someone, could actually be connecting with power from within. How am I using my power from within? Could be a power from behind, when sitting on the throne. Are you open and transparent and visible? How are you open and transparent and visible with your power? And then from a spiritual perspective, it could actually be power through. So that brings us into this beautiful area of presence. How am I present with my anger, with my spectrum of emotions? So we will be recommending this book. It's one of the resources that I think will really make a difference to people who are traveling with us on this masterclass journey. And I've been trained in Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, and he's actually written a little book. I think it's only about 40 pages long, but it's called Beyond Anger Management, Finding the Gift in Anger. So one of the things, again, we won't be diving in great depth, but I will be introducing the basics of nonviolent communication, because I think it's really helpful. It gets you in touch with around anger. How am I feeling anger? What am I needing? It talks about feelings and needs. What am I needing this moment if I'm angry? Because you get underneath it. And similarly with those you're with, if they're feeling angry, what could they be needing? So at the bottom of the tree, he talks about connecting. And as you move up to the top of the branches, it's then, well, if it's me, we look at how you can actually then express your needs through that anger in a way that connects with other people. And one of the things for me is I found that when I expressed and perhaps was some passion around my anger, I might have thought I'm being too heavy, I'm really being present with this, perhaps I'm being too angry. People said, I really feel you, David. I see that's important to you. And conversely, on that side, it might help me if someone is angry, connecting with them. What is it that they're needing? This empathy, what are they after? It could be verbal, non-verbal. So we'll be looking at the non-violent communication approach to anger and how that can be so helpful in business as well. And there's also, I work with Dr. John Blakey, who's developed the trusted executive model all around trust. This was his PhD at Aston University Business School. So he's done 6 years of research on this. And again, I'm introducing this model as someone may connect with it and use it in the masterclasses, because his model has 9 leadership habits, which you can see the little people on the screen. And what I wanted to say is the power of this model is that if in the organization, for example, you adopt the habits of being honest and open, for me, that actually means then there's less likely to be triggers for people to be angry because you're being open and honest. And another big one, again, myself and Rashmi were talking about this. He has one called Be Consistent. How often do we have bosses that say one thing one day and one day they say something different, or they intentionally, as John said, intentionally bring contention or inconsistency just to shake you up, to show they're in charge. So if you can be consistent, again, that helps people know where they are. There's less likely to be deviant expressions or flares up of anger. And on the left-hand side, to be brave, because it might be brave to, it's a brave journey, this, to actually get mastery around anger, and this passage of being kind in what you're doing as opposed to being nice. So again, one of the models that we will be introducing.
Fabulous. So is anger mastery for you? I mean, ultimately, only you can answer that. Hopefully, you know, as we've talked about the anger spectrum, anger triggers, some of the expressions of anger in the workplace and some of the frameworks we'll be using, you'll have a sense of, you know, is this useful? Am I going to learn more about anger for me, anger for my organization, and ways in which I might be able to develop both awareness and mastery? And I love this quote from Aristotle. You know, it is easy for anyone to get angry. Well, I should put a caveat on that. It's easier for some of us to express our anger, but on some level we are all triggered. But to know how to express anger to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, and with the right motive and in the right way, that is not for everyone, because that is not easy. And I can't promise that you're going to develop mastery over the course of our masterclass, but what we can promise is that you will massively sort of develop your awareness of anger, your ability to create some spaciousness so you can make more conscious choices about how you engage with your own anger or others' anger in your organization, and start to see that there are paths forward with skillfulness, potentially even practicing some tools and techniques that will help you be more skillful in developing anger mastery. So this 2x2 we thought would just be a useful one to help you answer the question of whether the masterclass is right for you. As you can see, we've got low awareness or high awareness. So how aware are you about your own anger on the left-hand side? And then what's your level of mastery, low or high? And I'll let you read what's in the slide, but I think it's fairly self-evident that pretty much the only box that probably doesn't make sense for you to join our masterclass is if you have high awareness and high mastery. In that case, you're already able to discern whether and how to use anger for transformation. You may learn some things in the masterclass, but it might not be the best use of your time. For each of the other boxes, whichever, if you fall into one of the other three, then we're confident that there's going to be some good value for you in the masterclass. David, is there anything you want to add on that?
No, I was just laughing actually, because both having taken MBA, we have to have a 2x2 in here somewhere. but actually we generated this 2x2. We sat down and I really like this 2x2. I think it's really helpful. Just people watching, just placing themselves where they are can be a great understanding, I think.
Yeah, very much. We debated as well having two of these 2x2s, one for self-awareness and mastery and one for external with respect to your organization. And that is something we'll go into greater detail in the masterclass, because it's useful to look at it both for the self and with a more of an external orientation as well.
Okay, and finally, before we bring in Lynn, actually just a kind of summary of where we're going with this masterclass series. So we consider actually this is for business and social sector leaders, coaches and consultants who want to reap the benefits from improved self-awareness and mastery of anger. And hopefully today you've taken something away for you where you can go and explore that. We're trying to make it as accessible as possible. So the times actually suit the UK, they suit across in the in USA and Canada and Eastern Time and Pacific Time as well. And there's 2 in March and there's 1 in April. And these are obviously 2-hour classes. We're going to be held on Zoom, and actually we take a decision to have a maximum of 12 participants in this masterclass, really so that you can get some really excellent interaction with myself and Rashmir and the other people taking place. So it feels a real part of a deep dive and a great journey with us. And yes, there will be practical assignments for you to go away and work in your organization with email support in between sessions, because we want you to make a real difference in your organization through this. So if you're interested, please, there's 2 links there. You can either myself or Rashmir, where you feel drawn to. Just schedule a quick, it's a 20-minute preliminary Zoom call. This is not a hard sell. This is just to check with you to see if it's a good fit for you, for your organization, and if this is really something that you want to do. And finally, I wanted to say, if you're a leader watching, you've got a team of 6 or more, we can actually provide a unique Anger Masterclass series, which we can tailor to the needs, your cultural needs of the organisation. Is there anything else you want to add, Rashmi?
No, that's great. Thank you, David.
Okay. So at this point, I know Lynn been watching, we get to the red button point about asking questions. So I'll stop the screen share. And I know, Lynn, I could see you've been taking some notes, and I know you have so much to say on this area. So really, I just invite you to ask us some questions, and we'll, in reverse, we'll ask you some questions as well.
Well, if I can just make a few comments first. As someone, I'm here because I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, and I have no problem whatsoever suppressing my anger, quite the reverse. And I would say I'm high on mastery and high on self-awareness, because the Aristotle quote is like, welcome to my life. I have had to learn to manage my anger because I was born angry, and it just comes out of me immediately. Feel it, and it's there, and I express it. So I have had to learn the pause. I had to do a lot of work to learn the pause. And the other thing I want to say for those out there who are saying, that's me too, Lynn, the acceptance of passivity is much higher than the acceptance of aggressiveness. And I totally understand why. So it took me a long time to hit that point, is passive aggressive is also a negative thing, and being the baddie because of anger expression. And I just want to say I completely resonate. I used to say I'm like the Inuits who have 100 words for snow. Well, I have 1,000 words for anger. Because when someone would say to me, you're angry, I'd go, no, that was frustration. No, actually, I was irritated with you there. You know, that wasn't rage or anger, because my sense of the ability to express is so frequent, or was so frequent, that I knew the nuances of it. Whereas for people who are numbed to action, that any kind of going against or power surge, energy surge, and at times it could be aggressive and going against, was seen as a scary anger thing. And it's like, no, that's what this looks like. So I thought this was absolutely superb. And to see that chart of the upset through to rage is like, oh yes, this is my world, because you don't have those conversations very often. So my questions in terms of where is vulnerability in all of this? Because for me, as an 8, it's easier to show strength and power and to blame out and to be looking for what's gone wrong. So you didn't use vulnerability. It's not a criticism, it's just a question. And I think your iceberg chart really is the one. I just wanted to really, it's what is that core emotion that's underneath that anger or numbness can be an expression of. And for me, it was often vulnerability and the need to be strong, or some kind of fear. Yeah. So.
Yes, and I think really the Enneagram is helpful in this. I think really we know, don't we, about Enneagram 8, that the vulnerability is sitting underneath that. And I would say, that regarding the my Enneagram 9, the vulnerability is, and it's linked into fear, is of expressing that anger. And I think if we've got a scale here, I think there's a vulnerability with anger, not quite full stop, but it's quite often, I think it's avoided in the organizations I've been part of, because no one really knows what to do with it. So it almost is a vulnerable topic to bring to the table. So just as you were talking there, Lynn, I thought, how wonderful if someone joins a masterclass or leader, so I'll bring the team on to actually get it out on the table and to have a conversation about it, and to know that actually it's safe to do so, because that's what we want to do here, have a safe space for people to explore anger. Because where is that given? I haven't seen it in organizations.
Read the Spirituality in Action book again. Mm-hmm. It's very much in there, because what people used to say when they came into the Center of Excellence, excellence in leadership, when new people came in, they'd go, oh, you can say anything here. I've never been in an organization. You can say anything as long as it's not disrespectful, as long as it's not rude, as long as it's not harmful, but you can say anything. And my doctorate, one of the 6 threads that I came up with as to what was working in the organization was welcoming, encouraging constructive dissent. Because as an 8, I thrive on it. So I think there's something that I would love your participants who come to really think about is, you talked about holding space. How big are you in your own understanding and awareness and what you can hold in the space? Because closing down openness, that I have thrown things in an organization. I have lost my temper in organizations when I was younger. And that was always because only certain things were allowed to be spoken. So again, you know, and you've touched on it beautifully. It's what can you yourself allow and hold the space for? And if you are averse to conflict, then of course it's harder. I always used to get, people always used to send the impossible staff to Lynn. It was like, send them to Lynn, and within a few months, they'll be working to their full potential again, because they could say anything. I'm not really scared of very much. I come from a family, working class family. My dad was an angry miner. You spoke it, you expressed it, but you never let the sun go down on your anger. We actually had to work it out, but you were allowed to express it and discuss things and work them through. Yeah. So there was a big tolerance of it. So I think it's fantastic. I have never been on any kind of course or discussion. Done lots of work on power since the 80s, but this expression of anger and the spread that you have engaged in and articulated, I think is quite remarkable. So actually, I think anyone who's still high mastery and high awareness can still learn a lot. And what's happened to me watching this presentation is for some things to be affirmed and to be cleared, and then other avenues to come into my consciousness. So I think it's a really clever and thorough and exciting offering that I've just witnessed. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lynn, and for sharing some of your experiences and expressions as well, because we were so eager for you to come in and join us in this, because we knew you had a very different experience with anger to David and I, and felt that would be enormously valuable for the group. So really appreciate the endorsement and the encouragement. And I want to add a component, if I could, to the question about vulnerability, which I think is an important one. I concur completely with what David said about the vulnerability of expressing and practicing. There's another component that I'm thinking of, which is underneath anger, as you said, is often a host of other emotions. It may be fear. It could also be desire. And so the inquiry, I guess, I would be holding would be, is the vulnerability connected to actually the vulnerability of what's truly desired? In which case, that opens pathways for a different kind of expression. And I think the possibly Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication and his focus on needs could be a really nice way into that.
I think, I think that's a really beautiful way of expressing it. And it is the importance of nonviolent expressing, because I used to frighten people, I didn't know why I was frightening them. I'm a big cuddly teddy bear, I'm just speaking my truth. I'm just getting it out. And I used to have PAs who would say, they've come out like they feel they've been impaled against a wall by you. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We had an honest, frank, fair conversation. And then added to that, yes, I'm a woman as well, but also as you get more senior in the organization. So one of the things I think is really important about hierarchical position and status and power in an organization and how you express, there's a whole chapter in spiritual leadership in action, which is about an incident where a group of staff really irritated me. And they were out of order. They were in the wrong. I still say, there's no doubt about it. So I go along and I really tell them what I think. And they're absolutely overwhelmed by that. I walk away feeling fine. And my coach, because I had a coach who was also doing organizational work, I had to do a lot of work in there. It's like, but they were out of order. They had abandoned something that needed to be done. And I had to do it. And I'm the chief exec and I don't actually mind, but they should have been there. So there was a huge insight for me. I hadn't shouted at them or anything, but I told them straight and clear. So we had an organizational conversation about it. And I apologized. And I said to him, it's really hard for me to apologize because there's still a bit of me that doesn't think I should because But my coach has got me to see there's a self-righteousness in there that's hanging on to something. And I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. And I actually was very emotional about it because it's like, this is really hard for me because I don't quite get why I'm still the bad guy here, you know. That was a massive breakthrough in the organization because they got that I'm not kind of going and trying to terrorize them or whatever. This is the truth, authentic truth of how I saw it. And I am a easy expresser. So I think the other thing is really important. Use the Enneagram, use some of the models you've got, that you understand. This is emotional intelligence, isn't it, as well? You understand together in your team the nuances of what is a different way of being and perceiving and expressing in the world and honoring it.
Yes. And I love that. And the other thing that's come to me actually when it's in anger is there's an opportunity to be curious about anger. And I'll give an example from my own career. And I was actually in charge of developing a customer experience for a major financial organization. And I said, actually, this needs to come from the grassroots. I need to go out to the front line, out to the branches on the high streets and have conversations with managers. So I thought I'd like a list of managers to go and see. So they came up with what I would call the usual list. And then I asked a strange question. I said, which branch would you advise me not to go to? Mm-hmm. And they named one. And actually, it was a female manager. Oh, she's always angry at us. Don't go there. And I said, put her down. I'm going down to see her. And they were horrified. So culturally, she had been written off as far as being, she was there still in a role, but as far as the head office was concerned, don't go and see her, don't involve her. Yeah. But I went out and it was really interesting because at the root of what was happening was she hadn't been heard, which is an element of anger. And when I got underneath that, she realized I was listening. That's another element for me. We then dropped into a conversation where she had some superb insights around customer experience and was passionate about customer experience. So when I went back and they were going, how do you get on? What happened? And I shared and what she came up with, it was a moment of shift for the people in that group in the organization to suddenly realize, oh my God, we've actually thought this way, our perception of how she expressed her anger, but actually she's got so much to give. So there was an opening up to that, but it took courage and bravery to go and have that conversation when everyone was telling me, David, don't do it. You'll be crazy to go do it.
And I think that's a beautiful story. And I have been that woman. And so I had to learn how can I get them to hear me? So I've looked at developmental models and different ways of expressing, from spiral dynamics to Torbert stages to also, I had to learn to be heard. And the other side, I would say, those of us who are born angry, when we channel that anger into its passion, the passion is often for social justice and fairness and equality. And so if you can harness the angry people, so I would sort of turn your story into a question for any participants. Who are those angry people in your organization that are being seen as not helpful or productive, and how do you harness it? I was always, I was going to say arrogant, was so good at my job, they put up with me in terms of, and the other thing is, I learned how to apologize. So often what I would come back is, okay, I'm really sorry about yesterday. The way I said it really wasn't as skillful as I would like to be, but the content of what I said remains. And you have on your charts about being the change agent or the shift. I was often, they used to call me the conscience of the organization and the shocker of the organization, because one of the values of the people who have that kind of energy and can't hold it in, but it's valuable what they're saying, is we will keep saying it. And I remember saying to people, you have to start listening to me earlier, because I end up having to really go at it. And that's becoming a pattern for me. I have to make a big fuss or go loud to be heard. And I'll take responsibility for doing it more skillfully, but you have to listen too. So it's a dance. It's an absolute dance. And I would just say, those of you who suppress and those of you who express too much, perhaps, learn from each other and see the value in each. That one isn't better or worse than the other. It's how can you learn and access both for yourself. So I'm not really I'm not angry now, and it can be much more skillful. Yeah. Fantastic. This is wonderful. I think it's really important work, because as I think it was David, one of you said, the anger's there.
Yeah, named or not, the anger is there, isn't it? That's my realization, both within myself and within any system. That's why I say it can be a team, a department, an organization. Yeah. And the skillfulness is almost knowing where you are then, because a department or an organization, it can mean you take different approaches, but that's just part of the skillfulness, I think, around using anger. And my sense is, have we touched on this? I think you have, Lynn. There is such a beautiful transforming energy in anger when it's used in a skillful way. That's one of the elements really I want to encourage those to take advantage of and make the most of. And yes, it does involve a journey. Yes, there may be times you feel very uneasy, you could feel vulnerable. As someone once said to me, David, get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And perhaps in these masterclasses, you're going to have challenges, but actually we're here to hold that space so you can work your way through that.
And in fact, I just want to say one thing. Anger, energy, it's power, it's energy. It's a form of energy that needs to be released, yeah? And the more we're in touch with it, the more it's appropriate, back to the Aristotle quote, the more it's a clean, pure energy that actually manifests itself in a skillful and appropriate manner. So I can make choices now, and I know when and I had to do a lot of work on emotional intelligence as well as the Enneagram. The Enneagram was the best thing for me. So it's knowing, recognizing it, and then literally, as you say, the self-awareness of what is going on inside me. Have I numbed out? Am I revving up? What's appropriate here? What is doing right? Okay, breathe. And then come out with a skillful response. And the skillful leader is the most effective leader and the most appropriate leader. That's how to get things done. Yeah.
Thank you. What a great place to bring this question answer to a close then. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate you being here with us.
Loved it. Really enjoyed it.
I'm just bringing up the slides. We've got one final closing slide for Rashmir to talk us through.
Brilliant. And while David's doing that, it's really just a recap of the masterclass series. So I'll start talking before it comes up. So I really just in awe, Lynn, of your comment that even with high awareness and high mastery, there's still value to be gained from the masterclass. I hadn't really thought about that, but I'm really heartened to hear that. So thank you for sharing that. And so if you are feeling that the masterclass is for you, that there's some real value to be gained, then we hope you'll come along. And the details are here. It's for business leaders, social sector leaders, coaches, consultants, anyone who really wants to transform their relationship with anger and develop awareness and mastery so you can use it for good. And the masterclass sessions will be in March and April. There are 3 of them. You can see the times on the slide. They'll all be held by Zoom. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, as long as the times and days work for you. We'd love to have you. The only time zone that I'm aware of it might not work for are probably those in Australia, but it may be a future series we can hold at a slightly different and more convenient time for people that are outside of these time zones. We will cap the number at 12. There's huge value. Anyone that's been involved in group work and group coaching will realize that there's huge value in learning from each other. But we also, as David said earlier, don't want to make the groups too big that we can't go deep with each other. And next steps are really, if you want to chat with David or if you want to chat with myself, just schedule a Zoom call with us and we'd happily talk you through, again, the 3 elements of the masterclass, or just discuss any concerns or questions that you might have. So go ahead and sign up for one of those Zoom calls. There's no high pressure selling. That's not our style at all. So you'll be able to have a call, and if it doesn't feel like a fit, either we'll let you know or you'll come to that conclusion yourself. The cost is there. And once again, for organizations or teams that want to work on this in a very specific way, David and I would be happy to talk with you about what that might look like for your particular team. So that's it. Thank you everyone for joining us. Lynn, thank you so much for your contributions and encouragement and appreciation as well. It's been wonderful to have you here. And I think there's a couple of your past experiences we might have to draw on and use in the masterclasses as well. David.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.